Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sarah and I'm an associate at Mighty Earth. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Today's webinar is going to cover the environmental and health impacts of the meat industry in the United States, and we'll also focus on what the private sector can do to drive supply chain solutions and how companies can clean up their meat supply chains. So we have presentations by Lucia von Reusner, who is campaign director at Mighty Earth, as well as presentations from Tarah Heinzen, who's a staff attorney at Food and Water Watch, and from Beth Gallagher, who's executive director of the Tri-State Coalition for Responsible Investment. And I will let all of them introduce themselves in a moment. But before I do, I wanted to briefly review our agenda for today. Oh, I am sorry, my screen just stopped. I will move us over to the agenda. So first, one moment, everybody. There we go. All right. First, we're going to have a presentation from Lucia at Mighty Earth, where she will provide an overview of industrial meat production and the role of the private sector in driving solutions to environmental issues that the meat production causes. Then we will have a presentation by Food and Water Watch on the environmental and community impacts from industrial livestock production in the U.S. And finally, we will have a presentation from the Tri-State Coalition for Responsible Investment on the investor perspective on environmental and human rights impacts of the meat sector. And following everyone's presentations, we will have a question and answer period. And throughout the webinar, don't hesitate to submit your questions via the Zoom webinar application. You should see on your screen a little Q&A box, and the questions will be submitted anonymously to myself and to Lucia for us to moderate and respond to at the end. So thanks everyone for joining, and with that, I will allow Lucia and Tarah and Beth to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lucia von Reusner. I'm the campaign director for Mighty Earth.
Hi, I'm Tarah Heinzen. I'm a staff attorney at Food and Water Watch. Looking forward to talking with everyone today.
Hi, everyone. This is Beth Gallagher. I'm the executive director of the Tri-State Coalition. Thanks so much for the opportunity to participate and look forward to the presentations.
Wonderful. So Mighty Earth, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a global environmental advocacy organization that is focused on reducing the environmental impacts of industrial agriculture around the world, with a primary focus on encouraging the private sector to step up and drive reforms through their global supply chains. So to start, I'm going to give a brief overview of the supply chain and the global impacts. Agriculture is a major driver behind many of our most urgent environmental challenges, from climate change to biodiversity loss to soil erosion, water pollution, drought, and ecological toxicity. Yet improving agricultural practices is where some of the biggest mitigation opportunities for many of these challenges lie, and is why our focus is really on driving the private sector to step up and take a leadership role, and is what we will be discussing on today's webinar. Production of meat is by far the dominant force shaping global agriculture. From growing the feed to raising the animals, producing meat takes up nearly 80% of global agri-land. For the purposes of this webinar, we will be largely focusing on cattle, pork, and the poultry supply chains. However, the issues we'll be discussing are relevant to almost any animal protein raised in the factory farm system. The sector is also responsible for 15% or more of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's responsible for about 60% of global biodiversity loss, including around 80% of global deforestation. It uses around 30% of global freshwater, and it's top water contamination here in the United States. The largest meat and dairy companies are ranking among the top private sector contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, alongside Exxon, BP, and Shell, and are receiving increased focus from public groups, scientific groups, and government agencies around the world. There is growing consensus among scientists, policymakers, and multilateral agencies that reforming how we produce and consume meat is one of the most critical strategies for ensuring that we can feed a growing global population on a planet of finite and increasingly threatened natural resources. Over the course of this webinar, we'll be giving an overview of the various supply chain practices causing the most urgent environmental degradation, as well as the solutions that companies must adopt throughout the supply chain in order to reduce these impacts. So to make sure we're all on the same page, here is a very simplified overview of the meat supply chain, starting with the feed, either grains like corn and soy and wheat or pasture, to the raising of the animals, to the waste, and then finally to slaughter. The impacts from transportation, packaging, and distribution, et cetera, are important, but beyond the scope of this webinar. As this chart from the Food and Agricultural Organization shows, production of feed is the dominant source of meat's environmental impact, which of course varies depending on the protein supply chain, but on a global scale, followed by manure and enteric fermentation, which is the scientific term for flatulence, primarily from cattle. To give everyone some visuals as reference points, these are a series of images highlighting the farming practices and problems used to produce meat, starting with the burning or plowing over of large tracts of intact ecosystems like tropical forests and grasslands, to plant large monocultures of corn or soy using highly intensive farming practices that are responsible for wide-scale soil erosion and require constant inputs of chemical fertilizers and pesticides to sustain, much of which then washes off into surrounding waterways to create toxic algae blooms and death around the world. Once the animals have consumed the feed, there comes the problem of the digestive waste. Here in the United States, meat animals produce around 13 times more feces than humans do, but unlike human feces, animal feces are not required to be treated before they are released to the surrounding environment. And some common yet highly polluting practices for managing manure are to store it in massive open manure lagoons, in the case of hogs like the ones seen above, and or spread it on surrounding crop fields as fertilizer, which is good in theory, but in practice, there's way more manure produced in these concentrated areas than can ever be absorbed by the surrounding cropland. Finally, there's the problem of enteric emissions, which is, again, the technical term for when cattle are digesting their feed and passing gas, and is a huge source of methane emissions, which are a massively potent greenhouse gas emission here in the United States. In terms of where these impacts are mostly located, the United States is the top global producer of meat and is where we will be largely focusing the rest of our discussion, since many of the largest companies are also American and headquartered here in the United States, and the model of factory farmed meat we use here is what's being exported around the rest of the world. Here in the United States, about a third of the continent is dedicated to producing meat. And the largest US meat producers also rank among the largest players globally, with just 3 to 4 companies here in the United States controlling between 25 and 75% of each major meat supply chain. And due to this high consolidation, there's also significant opportunities for a small handful of companies to drive much needed reforms across our agricultural system to make it less polluting and more sustainable. I will now turn it over to Tarah to talk about some of the environmental and public health risks here in the United States on the ground level.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint. All right, so that was a great overview, and I'm going to go into a little more detail on some of the environmental and community impacts of factory farming in the United States at more of the community level. So I won't be addressing greenhouse gases, but just to reiterate, this sector is a huge contributor to that pollution. So as Lucia said, the wastewater from this industry and the surface water pollution from it is one of the leading sources of water pollution in the country. This industry produces far more waste than all of the humans in the United States. It does not go through a wastewater treatment process. And it's important to note that this is not just manure. This isn't just a fertilizer. This is a toxic brew of manure, antibiotics, some of which are medically important, sometimes synthetic hormones, even heavy metals. And that stuff ends up in the waste stream, in these lagoons or pits under the CAFO confinement houses, or in the piles of dry litter. There are multiple ways that this manure fails to stay at the facility or on the field and ends up in our waterways. And despite the fact that the Federal Clean Water Act is supposed to rein in the pollution from this industry, decades after passage of that law, we have a serious problem of unregulation and underregulation of these operations. So one of the main pathways is pollution, acute pollution events from the CAFO facilities themselves. Here you've got an image of a very poorly managed dairy confinement where there's just waste flowing out of the production area. These operations are supposed to maintain all of their waste such that no water is going to contaminate with the waste and flow off of the facility. Clearly that isn't always the case. There are also extremely catastrophic events that can occur and are increasingly occurring, fueled by climate change. This is a photo of Hurricane Florence recently taken in North Carolina. These are 2 hog confinement facilities that have been completely flooded by stormwater, and the manure lagoons are not even visible anymore because the water rose so high. So all of the manure and the dead hogs presumably left in those confinement buildings now pose severe threats to the aquatic ecosystem and to public health downstream. My own colleague, Chrissy, our factory farm campaigner, lives downstream of one of these operations in North Carolina, and her own home was flooded by a mix of stormwater, hog lagoon manure that had been breached upstream from her, and probably coal ash waste as well. So the real human toll of this industry concentrating in areas that are vulnerable to these events can hardly be overstated. That said, despite the catastrophic events that are occurring, the fish kills and manure spills that have these huge short-term effects, probably the leading source of water pollution from the industry is from the actual application of the waste, even when that application occurs exactly as planned. This is just a picture of a manure tanker spreading waste on a field, presumably in accordance with some sort of nutrient management plan, according to what the crops should be able to uptake in terms of nutrients. But what we know is that often this waste is over-applied, or it's applied and then a rainfall may occur, or a snow melt may occur, and often those nutrients and other pollutants do end up in our waterways. And as Lucia said, agriculture is, as a result, the leading source of surface water pollution in the country. Agriculture is responsible for far more impaired river and stream miles than municipal pollution sources. This is a chart from the National Association of Clean Water Agencies looking at 1992 to 2008. And you can see that agriculture is a dominant source of impaired stream miles. And it's not just all agriculture. CAFOs specifically have caused water impairments in more than half of states, and that's just what's been documented and reported. We also know that the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, from this runoff is causing increasing incidence of algae blooms across the country and of harmful algae blooms that contain toxic bacteria. This is a huge threat to ecosystems, to communities, and to public health. The Environmental Working Group documented that algae blooms have increased 40% just from 2017 to 2018 alone. And the incidence of harmful algae blooms with toxic bacteria is also dramatically on the rise. Before I move on to groundwater contamination, I do want to note that slaughterhouse pollution is also a major source of surface water pollution across the country and often impacts many of the same communities that are on the front lines facing the water pollution from the CAFOs themselves, because this industry is very concentrated in certain communities and is increasingly concentrated. This chart from Environment America from 2014 shows that a handful of global meat companies, Tyson, Cargill, et cetera, are in the top 11 for the total pounds of toxic pollution released into waterways across the US. And this is reported to EPA for its toxics release inventory. So many of the same waste management or mismanagement practices that happen at the factory farms and impact surface waters also affect people's drinking water in rural communities. This is a photo of what you call a brown water incident from Kewaunee County in Wisconsin. And this is a very severe case of manure contaminated water reaching the groundwater table and getting into a residential well. But this type of contamination is often not seen and not noticed, and people are subject to extremely harmful levels of invisible nitrates and dangerous bacteria like E. coli without knowing it. Recently, the New York Times published this article calling this problem rural America's own private Flint, because rural communities are increasingly facing dangerous levels of nitrates and bacteria in their wells from the CAFO industry specifically. And this isn't just an issue in Wisconsin, it's an issue in many parts of the country where the bedrock is fractured and it enables nitrate contaminated manure and wastewater to quickly infiltrate the groundwater table and reach residential wells. And this is a USGS map showing areas of high risk, and you'll notice that a lot of these areas are also where the CAFO industry is heavily concentrated. I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little bit, of course, about the air emissions from this industry, because that's where many of the most immediate community impacts are felt. The photo on the left from the Socially Responsible Agricultural Project is of a multi-million layer hen facility in Tonopah, Arizona. And I showed this because you can actually see the visible haze of particulate and other air pollution around the facility being blown directly into the community surrounding this operation. What these facilities have to do just to keep the animals alive, due to the huge amounts of ammonia and other emissions being produced by the waste of the animals in the confinement buildings, is to install huge ventilation systems, fans that spew that pollution out into the community, just to keep the air quality inside the buildings good enough that the animals don't die. So of course the community bears the brunt of all of that pollution. And the stockpiles of manure and the lagoons also tend to attract vermin. This is a picture of a house just covered with flies in a community with factory farms nearby. Studies increasingly show that living in a community with factory farms has many types of adverse impacts on community well-being. It can cause increased incidence of depression, lead people to be unable to have guests over to their home. People cannot open their windows at night or hang their clothes on the line. Their property values decrease noticeably. But there are also severe public health impacts from this toxic mix of air pollutants. Some of the most well-known are ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. They're both respiratory and eye irritants. Hydrogen sulfide can be toxic in high concentrations. Ammonia can trigger asthma attacks. And it also contributes to water pollution when it redeposits near the facilities where it's being emitted. But these operations also emit more than 100 volatile organic compounds. They emit particulate matter, including dust and aerosolized bacteria, some of which may be resistant to antibiotics. And of course, greenhouse gases are part of the mix. There's been far too little research on the collective health and welfare impacts of this mix of pollutants. We have a lot of information about the very real dangers of being exposed to these pollutants one at a time, but very little information about what the full scope of impacts is on communities that are exposed to this whole mix of emissions. And what we know is that this industry is becoming more and more concentrated. These facilities are growing larger and more industrial in scale, and so the impacts on certain communities are only growing over time. So with that, I will turn it over to Mary Beth.
Hi, hold on one sec while I share my screen. Okay, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with you about our work. I'm going to share a little bit about the investor perspective on some of the issues that Lucia and Tarah have shared about the environmental and human rights impacts of the meat sector and how we work on these issues at the Tri-State Coalition. So just a brief introduction to the coalition. We're a group of 40 Catholic institutional investors in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area. Our members are religious orders and institutions that look at the management of their investment portfolio and consider how they can align their investments with their mission and values. So that contributes to a commitment to engage in active ownership of their portfolio companies on environmental, social, and governance factors, including issues such as climate change, water stewardship, human rights, immigration. where companies where we are shareholders may be exposed to reputational risk, legal risk, community opposition risk. We are members of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, ICCR. We're also part of the Series Investor Network and work with a broad group of investors in the faith-based community and values-driven investors to coordinate and collaborate on our shareholder engagements. And as a faith-based organization and an organization committed to advancing social justice, we try to approach our engagements with a perspective of impacted stakeholders. So we try to understand the impacts of community activities, of company activities on communities and workers, and integrate that into our engagement. So let's speak specifically now about our engagement with the meat sector. We, like I said, participate along with other ICCR members, and we look at issues around water stewardship, human rights and labor, deforestation, antibiotics, and animal health and welfare. While our coalition doesn't work on all of these issues, among the investor groups we're part of, there are different advocates leading engagements on these various issues. And as far as TriCry in our work, we've engaged with many of the relevant companies in the sector, including Tyson, Hormel, Cargill, McDonald's, Kroger, and Walmart. And what we try to do in these engagements is raise up concerns around company policies and practices and ensure that there are effective management systems in place and that there's the right governance structure within a company fully aware of these risks. So today I'm going to focus on two aspects of our engagement, first on water and then second on human rights. And obviously there's a lot of interconnection. Even from what Tarah just shared, you see that water impacts have a very human dimension as they connect to communities, water quality, air pollution, etc. So when we look at the human right to water, we're looking at how a company and its operations may impact communities' ability to have access to sufficient, safe, accessible, affordable, acceptable water. So that includes issues around water pollution, water competition, access to information about water discharges in a local environment. And so we really try to take a human rights-based approach to this and encourage companies to adopt human rights policies to govern their operations so that they're not just looking at the environmental impacts of water, but also the human dimension. I think we've heard pretty clearly about the different kinds of water pollution that exist from animal feed production, from livestock farms. So I won't go into that in much detail, but we'll say that with increasing water scarcity from climate change, all of these issues are going to be exacerbated. And as investors, we want to ensure that our portfolio companies have a good sense of these risks today and how they're going to manifest in the future. So some of these impacts we've heard about already, but I will say the issues of toxic algal blooms and nitrogen pollution are something that as investors we monitor because the more closely connected to these incidents a company is, the higher the risk to the company. And if they don't have good systems in place, strong policies in place that can really demonstrate a positive impact, then they're more vulnerable to being associated with these events. And a lot of these things manifest not just in business operations, but through the contract farmers, through the supply chain, and a company can be connected to all of those things. So there are impacts on drinking water, and when we look at all of these things as the industry becomes more concentrated and facilities are growing and bringing with them more farms and you know, the ecosystem of things that exist to supply a processing facility. It simply changes the landscape of a community. So there's a change in the local agriculture to more monocrops. There are changes in jobs. There are changes in transportation and moving animals and moving processing around a community. So we want to ensure that a company takes all of those factors into account and consults with the communities. It also exacerbates competition and places risk to soil quality. So how does this actually impact a company and the investor community? A company can face costs associated from mitigation. So if they're fined or involved in a litigation, there are costs associated with that to make the communities right. There is potentially risk of increased regulation at the state or federal level that will cost company to retrofit. As a company is looking to expand operations, it's important that it's perceived as being a responsible company that safely manages its impacts, or this can pose risk to its social license to operate, where communities may organize and oppose a siting facility. There could be damage to a brand from negative media attention and community resistance. And there could also be supply chain disruptions if a company is not adequately managing water risk throughout its supply chain. And I would say that investors have tools available, whether it's the CDP disclosure or other things, where we're monitoring how a company manages these issues more closely. And as the disclosure improves, there's a greater advantage for companies to manage these things. So what are investors asking companies to do? We're asking companies to take a risk-based approach to their water management. So understand where in their operations they're exposed to greatest risk and prioritize their efforts there. This doesn't just mean where they're facing the greatest public scrutiny, but where from a business perspective, there's risk of supply chain disruption or community opposition or increased competition for water. We want them to adopt and implement a water stewardship policy that applies throughout its business operations, for its contract growers, and its supply chain, to set time-bound sustainable sourcing commitments for its feed supply so that they can have a goal and demonstrate progress towards that goal and transparently disclose that progress. It's critically important to engage with stakeholders who are impacted, so a company is focused both on those issues that are material to the business, but also those issues that are salient to the communities that are impacted. And that can only be informed by conversation and engagement that's open and mutual. Disclosure is key for the investor community. So we want to see companies managing these risks and explaining to investors how their board is involved, what the incentive connection, how incentives are being tied to strong water stewardship. And as expectations are increasing, and looking at how climate and water risks go together, we're looking at whether the TCFD recommendations are something that a company is familiar with and is disclosing against. So it's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that's really looking at the material connections of climate risk to a business, and for the meat sector, that clearly gets to water issues and climate risk. And I think fundamentally it's important that if a company sets a commitment and increases its expectations, that they support farmers and growers through this process, that the responsibilities aren't forced upon growers, but that they're incentivized and supported either through education, technical assistance, or financing to carry the costs. Okay, now I'm going to focus on the human rights impacts. And this is something that we raise with companies that we engage as well. There are significant and well-documented labor rights violations in many of the meat processing facilities. There's a lot of disclosure and information about the poultry processing plant. There are over 300,000 people working in the poultry processing space, and those workers are working in sometimes unsafe conditions with wage and hour violations, with risks of discrimination and harassment, with other worker health and safety issues, such as inability to request the line speeds slow down or there's a pause in the line. So we're concerned that companies are incentivizing the processing plants and forcing workers into working in unsafe conditions. There's also a wide number of migrant workers in this space, whether it's in the growing of the feed or in the processing facilities. And those workers might be exposed to poor working conditions or also to risks of unethical recruitment practices, where workers are forced to pay a fee to get a job or may not have access to their identity documents. Again, the human right to water, it's part of the human rights impacts. We are concerned about the impacts of consolidation on community farmers and the economic impacts that massive consolidation of the industry are presenting around the country. And also, of course, as we look at food, we're looking at issues around hunger and malnutrition, ensuring that people have access to affordable, quality, healthy food. So what are the risks to the companies of human rights impacts? We understand what the impacts to communities are, but why should a company care, aside from the fact that it's the right thing to do? This is relevant for workplace morale and retention. People who are motivated to go to work are more likely to stay at the job and perform well and have pride in their work. There are obviously legal risks for human rights violations, whether it's related to a regulatory risk or litigation. Widespread reporting of poor worker health and safety at a facility can have a significant and negative impact on your brand and reputation. And there are increasing investor expectations, not only about climate change and water, but around human rights. So investors are looking more and more at how companies are implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and how they're disclosing their progress, not just on their management systems, but on the impact of their business efforts to reduce their human rights impacts. So if a company is auditing at their facilities, how do we know that those audits are contributing to improved performance and a reduction in negative impacts on workers? And all of this can also contribute to supply chain disruptions, which increases costs and delays. So the investor community really wants to understand how companies are managing the human rights risks associated with their business. And that starts with due diligence to assess, identify what their greatest risks are, establishing strong mechanisms to prevent those risks, mitigating negative impacts and providing access to remedy if a negative impact does occur. And for the meat sector, it's important to look at all potential stakeholders. So that's the workers throughout the supply chain, the farmers within the contract farming industry, the community stakeholders that live and work around the processing facilities and the contract farms. So a broad understanding of how a company impacts all of the human rights of potentially impacted stakeholders is really key. And finally, there's really a need for companies to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, many of which are relevant to the meat sector, whether it's related to poverty reduction, sustainable agriculture and ending hunger, or water, or decent work. So ensuring that companies are looking at what their role is relative to the Sustainable Development Goals is really important. But first and foremost, we want to see them reduce their negative impacts. So taking steps to ensure that workers that work in the poultry or meat sector have good protections, have access to remedy if there's a negative impact, and feel safe and respected within the workplace. I share here on the last slide a list of resources that we use to inform our work. ICCR has developed best practice guidance for the poultry industry, focus on many of the issues we talked about today, but also looking at the broader landscape, including issues around animal welfare and antibiotics. The third resource is one on ethical recruitment, which is a key issue that ICCR members have been focused on, which is relevant to the meat sector. Series has a good benchmarking called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty that analyzes the performance of companies in the food and beverage sector. And relative to disclosure on human rights, the corporate human rights benchmark and Know the Chain are relevant tools that investors are looking at to assess company performance, and those tools are factored into investment decision making for investors who are looking at ESG integration. So thanks so much. I'll wrap up there and welcome any questions.
Here at Mighty Earth, we've been seeing that public concern about how meat is produced is growing around the world and has prompted many companies to step up and drive reforms on issues ranging from antibiotic use, overuse to animal welfare practices. The private sector now has a critical role to play in reducing the environmental impacts of producing meat. Mighty Earth has a campaign underway to spur the meat companies to adopt more environmentally responsible farming practices, particularly around sourcing feed and managing manure. Last summer, we released a report tying America's largest meat companies to the largest dead zone on record in the Gulf of Mexico. And while our main focus is Tyson Foods, given its position as America's largest meat company with a significant concentration in those areas of the countries most impacted by the industry supply chain, we are focusing on driving reforms across the sector at large. Since our campaign has launched, hundreds of thousands of Americans have joined the campaign, signing petitions, writing letters to the CEO, placing op-eds and letters to the editor, rallying outside the headquarters. And our campaign has pulled together hundreds of local and national groups representing a wide range of stakeholders, from farmer groups to public health organizations to environmental groups, chefs, restaurants, fishermen, moms, and more, all of whom are increasingly impacted by the meat industry's pollution and want to see companies step up and take responsibility for providing solutions. Food companies that buy large quantities of meat have a critical role to play in holding suppliers accountable for setting clear standards and policies to reduce the environmental impacts of sourced meat. These include a requirement that all meat suppliers have a sustainable feed sourcing policy that ensures all feed suppliers are using best practices for preventing climate and water pollution, such as fertilizer optimization, cover cropping and diverse rotations, conservation tillage, and a ban on intact ecosystem clearance like forests and grasslands. A requirement that meat suppliers have a responsible manure management policies that applies to all direct and indirect suppliers, because current practice is that while many of the meat producers have very tight restrictions and standards for how contract farmers raise meat, the responsibility for disposing of the manure is left to the contract farmers who really don't have the economies of scale or infrastructure to dispose of it and have much higher risks of irresponsible disposal as a result. A requirement that meat suppliers have a greenhouse gas reduction target that applies to all direct and indirect and feed suppliers. And finally, food companies should set a specific goal for increasing sales from plant-based options and start actively leveraging sales and marketing channels to help shift consumption patterns towards these sustainable options. So to see what steps the private sector is taking, Mighty Earth evaluated the environmental criteria for meat sourcing policies across 23 of the largest food companies in the United States, including fast food, grocery, and food service companies. What we found is that while many of these companies have requirements around antibiotics and animal welfare, given consumer concerns and mobilization around those issues, not a single one had clear requirements around reducing the environmental impacts of their sourced meat, with just 4 starting to take steps under their greenhouse gas reduction targets. Some companies are doing some things in parts of their supply chain, yet the food industry as a whole is failing dismally to tackle the vast environmental degradation being driven by their industrial meat suppliers that poses very real and existential threats to the future of our agricultural system as a whole. We've all been seeing the stark warnings coming out over these past few months that our window to get serious about environmental degradation is closing fast. And the reality is that we are not going to be able to feed a rapidly growing global population without causing serious ecological collapse unless the private sector starts leading the charge towards more sustainable agricultural practices. So we hope this presentation has been both provocative and inspiring, and we now look forward to taking your questions or comments. And we've seen a couple come in already.
Right, thank you, Lucia. And as a reminder, everyone can submit questions via the Zoom webinar app. And for any follow-up questions after the webinar, you may also email Lucia, Tarah, and Beth, and all of their emails are provided on the screen. Thank you so much again to everybody for attending, and that we can start our questions. First question, first we'll go to you, Beth, and then Lucia, you can chime in as well. We have, in your conversations with corporations, do you encourage protein diversification away from animal agriculture as a way to mitigate risk? And if not, why not? And if so, explain how you're doing that.
Thanks for the question. In our engagements, we don't necessarily try to move a company into a specific industry or line of business. So what we encourage is risk assessment and scenario analysis. So we wouldn't be in a position to tell a company that they should pursue X or Y venture or acquire a certain business. But what we would encourage them to do is have strong governance of risk. And if the risks of a meat-heavy business present themselves in such a way that it doesn't seem like it's strategic for the long-term health and success of the company, then that would definitely be something we support. I think it may be perceived as micromanagement from shareholders to try to get into those kinds of recommendations. So that's not a strategy that we pursue at TriCry, but I would say that there are other investors that probably take that approach and have that lens and see their ability to engage with their companies to try to drive the long-term business strategy towards less intensive animal agriculture. I think that's happening. It's not something that we're doing. I think we would always welcome a strategic business decision in that direction because of what we understand as the human rights and environmental impacts of meat production, but it hasn't been sort of squarely within our asks.
Great. Yeah, and in terms, this is Lucia von Reusner from Mighty Earth, and in terms of our campaign, this is definitely something that we highly encourage. You know, shifting consumption patterns globally is going to be absolutely key to ensure that we have enough agricultural resources available to meet the needs of a growing population. And this is particularly true of the food companies that play an enormous role in shaping consumer tastes and preferences and creating demand for hamburgers and chicken nuggets around the world. And that is why we've included an ask for food companies to set a specific target for increasing sales from plant-based options to start leveraging their marketing and distribution channels to help shift consumption patterns in that more sustainable direction.
Awesome. Thank you both. Another question is for you, Tarah. How will severe weather events, which are made more frequent and more extreme by climate change, exacerbate the water risk facing companies or facing or the risk facing communities that are impacted by the meat industry?
That's a great question. So I think I'll start with the community impact. I mean, it's no longer debatable that there will be and already is an increase in incidence of severe weather events. Droughts and floods and extreme storms are becoming more common, as we've seen just looking at our southeast coast over the last couple decades. What used to be a 1,000-year storm has now happened multiple times in the last 15 years. So the community impacts of the severe weather accompanying climate change are undeniable, and they're becoming more severe with each increasing storm. We're going to see increased impacts like flooding in the upper Midwest. We'll see increased impacts from droughts in certain parts of the country. I recently have been working with a community organization in Iowa that identified that flooding that barely made the news in light of all of the hurricanes in northern Iowa caused dozens of concrete hog manure pits under the buildings to flood and overflow, and it barely made the news. But what we will see, I think, is that corporations will have to take note of how that's going to affect not only their legal liability, but also their reputation. And we haven't yet seen, at least I haven't yet seen, a responsible corporate response to these increasing events. What we are seeing is, a continued effort to put the liability for that pollution onto the contract operators, not the corporations that are ultimately driving the consolidation of this industry into certain communities. And that consolidation is what causes that waste to accumulate and causes the potential for these catastrophic climate-related incidents to occur. So I think we're going to need a mix of both campaigns like this to shine a spotlight on the corporate role in driving these community impacts. But we also need to accompany that campaigns that are forcing these companies to address the climate impacts of their supply chains. And I think we need a regulatory response that properly places responsibility for this pollution and these community impacts on the corporate integrators, not only on the contract growers that are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time to some extent, because that's where they need to operate to do business with certain companies.
Great, thank you, Tarah. Another question for Mary Beth, and if either Tarah or Lucia, if either of you want to chime in, feel free to as well. The question is, what financial incentive do corporations have to implement better practices related to the environment?
It's a great question, and I think one that people within corporations are trying to understand sort of how to manage the cost benefit of this. I think one of the challenges for having a really concrete and clear-cut answer is that some of these risks are cumulative, are long-term risks that don't manifest today. So it takes a company having a commitment to long-term sustainable performance to look at how to manage water risk and climate impacts and human rights impacts for the long term. So it's relevant to long-term success and performance. I think within our community, we clearly care about and look at these issues and how we are approaching company selection for being within the portfolio. I don't do asset management, but there's a growing community, significantly growing community that's looking at ESG factors and investment decision making to the extent that now $12 trillion are managed with an eye towards environmental, social, and governance factors, and that just continues to grow year over year. So there's a group, the U.S. Sustainable Investment Forum, that does a trends report and looks at the growth of responsible investment. And it's really increasing with millennials and other stakeholders really concerned about how a company does business and factoring that into their investment decision making. So as the ESG investor community grows, companies that have better management practices will be rewarded. And there's obviously reduction in litigation and reduction in negative costs associated with reputational harm and damage. But I think that more fundamentally, having good stewardship shouldn't need the financial driver. A company should be concerned about doing business in a way that doesn't cause harm to its workers or the communities that are located adjacent to it. So to a certain degree, the financial benefits are just supplemental to the benefits of being a good corporate actor.
Yeah, and this is Lucia. Just to echo a little bit of that, from our perspective, we've been seeing that consumer interest in where their food comes from and how it was produced is just growing, and as is public skepticism about how meat is produced. And this companies should both be paying attention to this from a risk management perspective in terms of the ecological capacity upon which all of our agricultural system depends. Numerous reports have been showing that we only have about 30 to 40 global harvests left due to dire soil erosion around the world. Similar time frame around mitigating climate change, there are increasing water shortages. And then there's also the reality that as consumers start looking for more sustainable options, companies that are able to demonstrate improved stewardships are more likely to gain access to premium high quality markets, and those that don't and continue lagging behind and publicly showing up as some of the nation's top polluters face increasing brand risk, loss of market share, and loss of social license to operate as they seek to expand into new communities who are increasingly aware about the very real costs that they will be forced to bear should these companies move in, and and be weighing that in any of their kind of work around the company.
Great, thank you both. Another question for Tarah, which since your presentation focused on the community impacts of the meat production sector, the question is, what has the reaction of people on the front lines been, if you could elaborate upon that, to pollution from the meat industry, whether it's communities that are close to meat processing plants or close to corn and soy fields where animal feed is grown, or whether they're close to concentrated animal feeding operations. If you could just elaborate upon your experience in that arena.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Food and Water Watch works closely with grassroots and state-based partners all over the country. And, over the past several decades, community groups have been really rising up and organizing and fighting back against this industry in a lot of different ways. For example, communities and individuals in North Carolina are suing Smithfield in I think it's about 600 individuals in dozens of lawsuits for the nuisance, air pollution, quality of life impacts from being subjected to the pollution of thousands and thousands of industrial hogs. And those cases have been very successful so far. The first 3 jury verdicts went in favor of the plaintiffs, and the total awarded penalties at this point, I believe, were about $500 million. So I think Smithfield is now in settlement discussions with the remaining plaintiffs in those cases. So that's one way that communities are organizing, working together, and fighting back against the big meat companies that have been really treating them as a dumping ground for their pollution. But communities all over the country are also organizing without litigation. In Iowa, for example, community groups have banded together to fight off a proposed Prestige slaughterhouse and successfully kept that slaughterhouse from constructing in their community. Ultimately, it ended up finding another location where there was less organized political opposition, unfortunately, and has been built since. But that shows the power of these communities when they work together and get resources from organizations. We work very closely with a group called Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. They help community groups work together to fight proposed factory farms and have stopped numerous facilities over the years. We also work with community members who are impacted by the pollution from slaughterhouses. We have members who kayak and recreate downstream of slaughterhouse discharge points in Pennsylvania and elsewhere who are helping us with legal strategies to fight back and hold that industry accountable. We also have community organizations getting plugged into broader discussions with national level organizations so that there's an increase in information sharing and learning from other communities' experiences across the country. Because what we know is that if a facility tries to go somewhere and is unsuccessful due to community opposition, that will end up in someone's backyard unless that group is also prepared to fight back. So one thing we try to do is work with as many partners as possible to empower and resource those frontline organizations, because they often are so under-resourced, which is why we see this industry increasingly located in low-income communities and communities of color. So there's a lot of opposition at the very local level to different parts of this industry, and I think it's only going to grow as the industry's impacts are unveiled by this type of campaign and others, as there are successful fights to unveil industry practices by striking down unconstitutional ag-gag laws and other industry efforts to block transparency about their practices. I think people are becoming much more aware of what the real impacts will be for their quality of life and their community if this industry gets a foothold. And so the opposition is only growing.
Great, thank you so much. All right, everybody, that concludes today's webinar. The webinar was recorded and we'll be sending out the recorded version to everyone who registered. Thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate you all joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.